Ready? Okay. I'd like to call this December 15, 2022 meeting of the Board of Zoning Appeals to order. Has the Kansas Open Meetings Act required notice been properly provided?
I can confirm that the packet was posted and the required notice was provided.
Thank you. I will have the roll call.
All right, we'll call Board Member Troe.
Here.
Board Member May.
Here.
Board Member Owens.
Here.
Board Member Waters.
Here.
Chair Dorsweiler. Vice Chair Hardy.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum of 5 members present, and we have provided public notice of today's meeting, so that gives us jurisdiction to go on and consider the rest of today's business.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. The first order of business is the approval of minutes of the November 17, 2022 regular meeting. Are there any additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, do I hear a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve that the minutes is printed.
Thank you. Second?
Second.
I have the second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. New business, we have 3 items. The first item is 3.1, application V22-11. Mr. Andrews.
Yes, the application V22-11 has been filed by Mr. Larry Zerbeck, and the request before you is a rear yard setback variance of 2 feet from 25 feet, which is the minimum rear yard setback required in an R single-family residential district. And the request is a variance to reduce that to 23 feet, and that is to allow construction of a 14-foot by 22-foot rear covered deck at the back of the house. The property we're looking at is on the north side of Pheasant Lane, east of Marymount Road, and the physical address is 2109 Pheasant Lane. And Spencer Aiken, our new planner, will be presenting this report on this item.
Thanks, Dean. I'll just pick off where he left off. He gave us a great introduction. So this property is part of the Georgetown Edition, which was platted in 1974, and this lot was zoned R when the city was comprehensively rezoned in 1977. So this dwelling has a building footprint of 2,320 square feet, which comprises 28% of the lot, and the lot size is 8,067 square feet, which is a very small lot size in the R zoning district, which has a minimum lot size requirement of 8,500 square feet. So on October 5th of this year, Grant Warhurst of Midwest Siding submitted a building permit application and plans for a 14 by 22 foot rear yard covered deck. So covered decks are treated as additions, and so they must conform with setback requirements that would be applicable to dwellings. And the rear yard setback, as Dean noted, for this dwelling in the R zoning district is 25 feet. So the owner was given options to either reduce the depth of the covered deck to 12 feet, renovate the existing uncovered deck and just not put a cover up, or to apply to this board for a variance. The owner obviously chose to apply for the variance and stated that the justification was because city code requires the post to be located outside the deck, and the current deck footprint would require that variance. So in terms of uniqueness, the applicant states that the intent of this variance is to renovate the existing 25-year-old deck while adding a deck cover where the total footprint would slightly increase because of that cover. This reason is because deck covers facilitate longevity of the deck because they help protect from excessive sunlight and drainage. So staff has not been able to identify many significantly unique conditions on this property that are not shared by other properties in this Georgetown edition. So all lots to the north and south of Pheasant Lane are 100 feet deep. Also, all lots on the north and south sides of Village Lane, which is directly north of Pheasant Lane, which aren't on the cul-de-sacs, are also 100 feet deep. North of that, on Applewood Lane, all lots are 115 feet deep. So this lot depth is average in this subdivision. They range from around 91 feet at the lowest end and about 120 at the max. However, this lot is smaller than the current minimum R-lot size requirement and is shorter than most residential lots in the city, which since the 1970s have usually been about 120 to 130 feet deep, which obviously would allow more space for this type of a deck cover. So in terms of no adverse effects on the neighbors, the property owner stated that the 6-foot privacy vinyl fence that's currently existing in the side and rear of the property would make the covered deck encroachment less visible from neighboring properties to the sides and rear. Staff does not believe approval of the proposed variance would cause any adverse effects on neighboring properties and thinks that renovating the deck and adding a cover could actually improve appearance of the property, potentially the neighborhood, and also potentially increase property values. So it should be noted that along this block, north of Pheasant Lane, between Marymount Road and Beechwood Road, I believe every neighbor has a rear yard deck. I can't tell exactly from an aerial view if they're covered or not, but it appears that this proposed deck would be compatible to the footprint of those surrounding decks. The property owner stated that with the current setback requirement of 25 feet, meeting this setback would only allow for a 10-foot deep covered deck, which would be a reduction from the existing 12-foot deep uncovered deck, and this would not be functional as an outdoor living space. Staff agrees that a 10-foot deep covered deck is short and it's not really a functional shade structure. I don't believe you'd be able to fit a round table on that with chairs on all the side. However, staff would request that the applicant provide some additional information on the hardship that would result from being limited to having an uncovered deck. The applicant states that this is a private residential property and the covered deck will be structurally sound and won't adversely affect the general public. And staff agrees that any potential impacts from a covered deck would be localized and wouldn't result in things like blocked sunlight or air, increased fire spread risk, drainage onto neighboring properties, as it would all be well contained on the lot. So a variance should not be granted that undermines the purpose for which a regulation was originally adopted, and rear yard setbacks ensure dwelling units and other structures aren't placed too close to neighboring properties to preserve open space, provide play space, and allow for the passage of sun and air. So the question for the board to decide is whether the addition of a 14-foot deep shade structure to the rear of this home is too much covered area for the size and depth of the lot and surrounding neighborhood. The question is with the existing circumstances in terms of the dwelling size, the location of the dwelling, and the lot depth, is there justification to allow a 14 by 22 covered deck? So the board could approve a 2-foot rear yard setback variance from 25 feet to 23 feet as requested. The board could approve a lesser variance than requested, so a shade structure less than 14 by 22. The board could postpone action on this application to a future meeting date if the board determines that additional information is needed, or the board could deny the applicant's setback variance request. So staff came up with possible findings in support of approval, which are that this variance request is unique because the location of the existing dwelling in relation to the rear property line limits the size of a rear yard shade structure to 10 feet, which is too narrow to provide functional outdoor living space. The platted depth of this lot is substandard compared to many other lots in surrounding subdivisions at only 100 feet long. So this variance will not adversely affect the rights of adjacent property owners or residents because the proposed shade structure will match the dimensions of the covered patios on the lots to the north of Pheasant Lane between Marymount Road and Beechwood Road. Strict application of provisions of the zoning ordinance will constitute an unnecessary hardship upon the property owners because if the 25-foot rear yard setback requirement is strictly applied to this lot, the owner would not be able to have a functional, usable rear yard covered deck. This variance will not adversely affect the public health, safety, morals, and convenience of the community because approval of the rear setback variance as requested will not affect the general public. Any impacts from this shade structure would all be localized on this lot. And lastly, this variance will not be opposed to the general spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance because the proposed covered deck will be open on 3 sides and won't encroach into any side yard setbacks. So to conclude, staff again would request that the applicant provide additional information about the design, materials, and color of the shade structure, as well as the hardship that would result if they were limited to having an uncovered deck. But if this is provided to the satisfaction of this board, then staff would recommend approval with the following conditions. First, the proposed shade structure shall be compatible in design, roof slope, and color with the existing dwelling. And construction of the shade structure must substantially conform with the plans as presented to and approved by the board, subject to the issuance of a building permit. That concludes this presentation, and staff and I believe the property owner and applicant are in attendance, so we can answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Are there any questions for staff for this application? This structure falls under the lot coverage 30% maximum requirement.
It does.
It does
Covered
barely, I
decks are
believe.
included, as well as sheds and other items.
Do you know what the percentage is on this with the?
It's slightly over 30% if this is approved. It would go from 28 to slightly over 30%.
I think it was 30.5%.
30.5?
I believe so.
And I think you mentioned there was a shed on this property as well?
Yeah, we don't have any records for this shed. We don't have, there's 2 items related to the shed. One is that we do not require a building permit for a shed that's 10 by 12 or less in size. That appears like it might be larger than 10 by 12. The other thing that's of significance is that the city ordinance does not allow the placement of sheds in a utility easement because a shed can, if it's placed in an easement, can deny access to utilities that are in the backyard utility easements. So if you do not get a permit for a shed, we can't advise you as to where you can and cannot place it. But we could not find any record of a permit for this shed, so it was not added to the lot coverage calculation, and we don't know whether it's 10 by 12 or larger.
But it would be included in the lot coverage as well?
Yes.
All right. And it should be considered as part of the application?
It should be considered as part of what's under rooftop on that lot. I said what we don't, technically, it's one of the holes we have in our system is that notwithstanding the fact that you don't need a permit for a 10 by 12 shed, you still cannot place a 10 by 12 shed in a utility easement. But if you don't apply for a permit or you don't inquire, we can't advise you of that. So, but what we determined was that approval of this deck would put the lot coverage slightly over 30%. However, it was not significant enough over 30% to justify requiring a variance for that.
All right. Other questions?
Does it appears the house that's directly behind it is very close to the property line. I don't know if that's, was there ever a variance granted for that house that we're aware of?
I'd have to have Mr. Hers put up an aerial photo for us to respond to that. It is, and it would be a generous interpretation, but it is possible that the previous building official determined that to be a corner lot on the cul-de-sac. And so if it's a corner lot, because it has frontage on Marymount and it has frontage on Village Lane, on a corner lot, you can a corner lot has 2 front yards and it has 2 side yards. So in this case, instead of having a rear yard, it's very likely that it was determined to have a front yard on Marymount, a front yard on Village Lane, a side yard to the east and a side yard on the south. A side yard setback is 7.5 feet. So I'm guessing, I haven't done firsthand research on it, but because it's a double frontage lot with 2 front yards, then anytime you have a lot with 2 front yards, it has 2 side yards and no rear yards. So the south lot line may have been determined to be a side yard, which has a minimum setback of 7.5 feet.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I have one question. Do we know the setback on the property to the east of that?
Justin does?
Without a survey, it's tough to tell exactly what it would be, but from the soffit and the fascia, which would be the overhang of the roof, not necessarily the sidewall, to the fence, which isn't necessarily the property line, it's showing 22 feet. So this measurement is pretty accurate, but it's not necessarily referencing the correct relative points that we need to measure. In other words, we're not measuring from the outside wall of the structure to the property line. We're measuring from the eave and the soffit to the fence.
We measure to the foundation wall when we measure setback. So if you have an overhang, a roof overhang, roof overhang will appear in an aerial photo. But when we measure in the field, we measure at the base of the foundation wall. So it might be slightly short of 25 feet, but it is likely very close to 25 feet to the foundation wall at the rear here. Again, one of the challenges, and there's pluses and minuses from the property owner's standpoint, but one of the challenges we have on these types of permits is that we didn't receive a survey with this building permit, and we didn't receive much of what could be called a site plan. So when we get in situations like this, staff takes the best information available that we have from original building records and others and constructs a site plan. So in this case, my determination that this had a 23-foot setback was based on the survey from the original house construction. And as some of you may know, it's pretty unusual for a contractor to build a new house and get everything right on the money. And so since we didn't have a current survey of the property, we took the best information we could, and we knew what the setback was of the house without the deck. So we simply did the math and determined that since the house was 37 feet from the rear property line, you put a 14-foot deck on it, that reduces the setback to 23 feet. That's how we arrived at the calculation. But From a plan reviewer's standpoint, would it be great to get a survey on every building permit application we get? Yes. From a property owner or contractor's perspective, providing that for a project like this is not viewed as being desirable for the city to require a survey for this, so we do the best we can.
Dustin, going back to that aerial and the property owner, so that existing deck is going to be the 14-foot plus the 2-foot overhang?
We believe that the uncovered deck is 12 feet.
Oh, 12.
And what makes it 14 is the placement of supports outside the footprint of the deck. So, and
Yeah.
Mr. Akins looked at this along with me. I did the initial building permit review, but that's what we were able to determine was that the existing uncovered deck was 12 feet wide.
Yeah, the deck renovation will encompass the same length as what's existing. So the variance really is for those posts outside the deck
And the roof.
and the roof.
Any other questions? Is the applicant available for presentation?
Yes.
Approach the mic, please.
Yes, I'm
And
Grant
sta-
Warhurst with Midwest Siding.
And state your name and address, please.
Grant Warhurst, Midwest Siding. It's business address is 1550 South Broadway. Residential address 6701 West State Street.
Go ahead. Go ahead and tell us what you have in mind and as related to some of the things you've heard, and then we'll have a chance to ask you
Okay.
questions as well.
Yes, you're correct. The existing deck is only 12 foot. The post, being city code, they have to be mounted on footings outside there. So actually, we're not going to encroach. The posts are going to sit immediately outside the deck. We just got to be able to dig those holes for those footings. So the roof overhang is what's going to make it the 14 feet so that the deck is entirely covered by there. But is that where the measurement starts from? Does it start from the post, or does it start from the soffit overhang? Because I mean, if it starts from the post, then we have ample distance.
It starts at the posts.
So the variance shouldn't be needed then if it starts at the post.
Why wouldn't the variance not be needed if the posts are outside the deck?
The posts are outside the deck. The deck's only 12 foot. The patio covers 14 foot from there. We were requesting the 2-foot variance, but the overhang of the 12-foot deck and the 14-foot make up that 2-foot difference. So the posts are going to be immediately, 3 inches outside the deck area.
So what accounts for the 14 feet? Because one of the problems with this application is trying to interpret the plans.
Okay, the overhang.
So that an indication that the posts were causing it to extend 2 feet to the rear of the 12-foot deck is not accurate. Is that what we're saying?
Yeah, only the roof overhang would extend into that 14-foot area. The post would sit at the edge of the deck.
So 14 foot is the overhang. Okay.
So since we don't have a survey and we don't have a site plan, what is the distance from the rear property line to the posts?
It would, for 22 feet with the 14 foot, so I mean,
If we took 12 feet off the 37-foot setback, so that puts it at 25 feet. The posts are outside the 12-foot uncovered deck. So what is the distance from the rear property line to the post supports?
24 feet, 9 inches.
So where did the 2-foot come from? Is that from the overhang?
Yes.
Okay, so we've got all those items in the minutes, and you can take those into account how you see fit, but that is part of the challenge of doing a permit review when you do not receive a site plan.
All right, do we have questions for the applicant? Hearing none, I'll bring this item back to the board for discussion and possible action.
So theoretically, that would mean if you viewed the setback in the same vein as the lot coverage, if we, as a staff, had been shared the same information that you had just been shared today, we probably would not have required a variance for the setback any more than we would have for the lot coverage, because even if the setback is less than 25 feet, it's not sufficiently measurably less than 25 feet to justify a variance. It would be something that we would categorize as de minimis, and so if something is 5 or 6/10 over of a percent over on lot coverage, it's not something that's going to be noticeable or worth bringing to this board. But based on the information that we had and we interpreted, it appeared to us that the post supports were going to add 2 feet to the depth of the deck, and so that's how we made our interpretation. But for future reference, just like we measure to the foundation wall, we would measure from the rear property line to the deck supports, not to the edge of the roof. Just as we don't measure from the edge of the roof soffit to the property line, we measure to the foundation wall, and the post supports for a deck would be considered the foundation wall.
And so the answer is we have no variance to act on?
Well, the answer is you have a variance. It's less than 25 feet. It's just minusculely less than 25 feet, which means the impact of approving a variance should have minimal impact on any neighbors. 1 and 2 would be minimal enough that it wouldn't be noticeable.
So this would have fallen in the category of administrative decision rather than bring it to the board?
Yes.
All right.
It's a somewhat scientific term, but we use the term de minimis, which means that it's so small as to almost not be measurable. Because I was reviewing some as-built surveys and things with a title company, and they had some homes that were built that had side yard setbacks that were 7 feet 4 inches, 7 feet 3.5 inches. They were technically not 7.5 foot setbacks, but we provided a written opinion that those setback variations were de minimis. They're so small you could go out there and measure them 3 times and you might come up with different numbers each time. So had we had a site plan and had we been able to interpret this better for you, the chances are we would have said that the encroachment into the 25-foot was minimal enough that it would not justify a variance request, but that's not the way we interpret it. But it's not that it meets strictly the 25 feet. So it is still worthwhile to grant a rear yard setback variance, but it's just not to the extent that we interpreted it to be.
Would this be something where if we just like put it back to you and you could go out and get that the measurements and make sure, would that be something that would have to be done? Or
no, I mean, if we issue a permit and the deck cover's put on, we're going to go out and inspect the deck cover after it's constructed, and we'll go out and do those things. But the one thing we will not do in a case like this is we're not going to go out and knock on Mr. Zerbeck's door and ask him if we can go in the backyard and measure it up for him.
Okay.
We expect the contractor to do that. And so when the contractor doesn't do that, then we have the challenges that we have today. But we will go out and do a final inspection and confirm those things, but if we have a building permit application and we can't translate what it is, we're not going to go out on each and every building permit case and go out and try to do our own measurements. That's part of the plan submittal process for the contractor and the owner.
Okay, any other discussion from the board? Does someone want to propose an action?
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve application V22-11 with the staff recommendations.
For the conditions?
Yes.
Okay. Do I hear a second?
I second.
Second that. Any further discussion? We have the application V22-12. We have a motion and a second for it to be approved. Any other discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Oh, take that back. Do we have any public comments on this one?
We do not have anyone on Zoom currently from the public.
Okay, very good, thank you. All right, I'm a newbie at this, so apologize. All right, so if there's no further discussion, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries.
So for everyone's benefit, we have a pending building permit for this covered deck, and we will issue a permit for the deck based on those plans and based on the setback variance that you have granted this afternoon.
Okay, very good.
Appreciate your time and attention.
Thank you. Next on the agenda is application V22-12, staff report.
Excuse me, I'll have to recuse myself from this, the next two items.
Very good.
So we have item 3.2 and item 3.3. Both of those applications relate to the same piece of property, which is what we'll refer to as the H.D. Lee Buildings Complex, which is located at the southeast corner of North Santa Fe and Elm Street. And so we've provided you with some background about Mr. H.D. Lee and his properties. But the first application, which is V22-12, relates to a request for a residential density variance of 49 dwelling units per acre to go from 43 dwelling units per acre, which is the maximum that's permitted in our R3 district, which is our densest residential district, to go up to 92 units per acre. And that request is to allow the three buildings comprising the H.D. Lee Building Complex to have up to 135 apartment units. And so we have provided you with the background. The redevelopment of Phase 1, or the north building, took place in 2018. And so if you take those 53 units and you spread them over the whole zoning lot, that doesn't result in a need for any type of density variance. But we now have the Overland Property Group coming forward, and they would like to add 50 units in Building 2 or Phase 2, or 32 units in Building 3 or Phase 3. And so when you add those together, it results in a density proposal of 92 housing units on a 1.47 acre, or 135 units on a 1.47 acre site, which is 92 units per acre. And so, as we look at the factors that you are to consider, one of those is uniqueness, and uniqueness relates to the vertical nature of these properties, which we're talking about buildings that are existing and are 5 stories in height. And so the applicants view this as unique because these are some of the few buildings that are over 3 stories in height, and they are limited to the footprint and the dwelling that they're trying to adaptively reuse and redevelop. And so they're trying to maximize the use of the existing footprints that are there. And so we would agree that these are unique because they are 5 stories in height, whereas if you go around the community, most new apartment construction in Salina consists of garden-style apartments on a greenfield site, and these are certainly not on a greenfield site. They're an adaptive reuse of existing multi-story dwellings, and our development pattern here is vertical, it's not horizontal, and so that results in the higher density. The applicants point out they're not impacting or changing the existing footprint of any of the buildings in any way. There won't be any change experienced by neighboring properties, and they believe they're helping to eliminate a potential blight from buildings that have been sitting vacant on Santa Fe for some period of time. And so, from an effect on the neighborhood standpoint, we do agree that adding the additional downtown living units will help activate this block and the entire downtown. And it appears to staff that the positive impacts of adding 135 plus new residents would outweigh the impact of having them occupy a comparatively small area. As far as hardship, the basic premise is that if they cannot maximize the number of dwelling units, then they're going to have the same fixed costs to fix these buildings up. And if they are substantially reduced in the number of units they're able to deliver, then they're not going to be able to secure the necessary financing to proceed. And so we would agree that if you strictly applied the 43 units per acre requirement, this development would be limited to 63 apartments instead of 135, and that would certainly result in a hardship and probably make it impossible for the project to proceed. One of the things that's pointed out as it relates to health, safety, and welfare is they are providing all life safety features that are needed to support a population of 135 housing units. And so, again, they emphasize the fact that they're trying to bring more life to the downtown area. And we would agree that this would actually benefit the welfare and convenience of the public, as it would add to the residential housing mix downtown. And most importantly, it would put a vacant, neglected building into productive use. And so the board may wish to inquire about why we even have residential density limits. And part of the reason those are in place is for compatibility purposes, but also to ensure that you don't have projects that overwhelm utility systems that aren't designed for that many residents, or a street system that's not designed to support that many residents and then also prevent them from dominating the surrounding neighborhood. So if you pick this development up and put it on Pheasant Lane on the location that we just discussed in the last application, it could be viewed as dominating that neighborhood. Developers emphasize that this is a unique case that's offering unique housing opportunities for Salina. And so we do have a fairly dense development pattern in downtown Salina. So if you're going to have higher densities, this is the place to do it. It's the best place for it. And so as we look around to other developments or comparable developments, we have two that in town that are slightly comparable. Those would be Johnstown Towers and Oakdale Plaza. And our ordinance does recognize or try to accommodate high-rise facilities for the elderly, and they do that by reducing the lot area required per dwelling unit for elderly housing. And so in high-density elderly housing projects, you can have up to 86 units per acre, and this is comparable to the proposed density of the Lee Lofts project. So if we're looking for comparables, this would be comparable to the density at the Oakdale Plaza Tower. It's just that this would be for the general population and not limited to elderly housing. So as it relates to the total density, you could approve application B22-12 and approve a density variance to allow the 135 apartment units. You could approve a density variance, but a lesser density than requested. That would require the applicant to reduce the number of apartment units in either building 2 or building 3 or both. And so you would need to provide some direction as to what you think is an appropriate reduction. You could postpone consideration of Overland Property Group's variance request to a future meeting if you find that either staff or the applicant needs to provide you with better information, or you could deny the variance request if you don't think the findings can be made to support a density variance from 43 dwelling units to 92 units an acre. We have provided on page 8 of your report some findings that we think would support granting a density variance in this particular case. The first one deals with the uniqueness because it involves the adaptive reuse of an existing multi-story set of buildings. We don't see adverse effect. We think that this project would actually enhance the surrounding area and the entire downtown. If you limited this project to 63 apartments, that would make the project economically unfeasible. And so we do think that all life safety features are being provided to support the additional residents, so this will not affect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. And we don't think this is contrary to the spirit and intent of the zoning ordinance because, one, the lofts are in the downtown area where higher residential densities are encouraged, and secondly, this density is comparable to high-rise apartments that the city already has for the elderly, such as Johnstown Towers and Oakdale Plaza. So we do have the project architect and a representative of Overland Property Group if you have questions about the Lee Lofts project. But before we do that, I'd be open to any questions that board members might have about the density variance that's being requested.
Thank you, Mr. Andrew. Are there questions for staff? I do have one question. This relates, it's a tangential question. There's we're talking about providing a hardship to other buildings in the area, and I was wondering if this particular project was built as presented, would someone that, say, wanted to improve that, I forget the name of the building now, that's north of the post office. In my knowledge, it's vacant. Would that, and that would be proposed as a high-density building as well. Would that be something that would not be able to be considered then because we have the Lee buildings already in place?
Well, this does, I mean, the findings that you would be making here would be setting somewhat of a precedent and could be applied elsewhere. So if you were to approve this today and there was a request to redevelop that for housing later, you and we as a staff could go back and look at these same types of things and say, does this involve the adaptive reuse of an already existing multi-story building? Yes. Does it, will it actually enhance the surrounding area as opposed to having adverse effects? You could conclude that yes, it would. It's probably, could be assumed that the same kinds of challenges that you have of renovating older historic buildings would apply. And if you limited artificially the number of housing units, that would probably make it unfeasible to do. And you could look at that to see if they were providing all the necessary life safety features, and then the comparison could be made to the Lee Lofts if that were approved, or to other projects. But from staff's standpoint, it would be a matter of going down and saying, does this building location share some of the same attributes of the Lee building? And the answer is probably yes.
But the proximity of the two structures would not, one would not affect the other.
No, you'd just be looking at the physical attributes of it, not its proximity.
So
Because
things like,
you're not doing a market analysis to say, do we need this many units? It's a function of, does this share similar characteristics to the Lee buildings?
very good. Thank you. All right, is the applicant available? Please state your name for the record.
Yeah, my name's Austin Cack. I'm a developer for Overland Property Group overseeing this development, and the business address is 254 North Santa Fe.
Very good. Would you go ahead and address any of the comments that staff made and maybe clarify some things?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if this is the right avenue to ask this question. The only thing that we were wondering in terms of clarification is whether or not this board is the final approval for this. So at some point, we'd like that addressed. But outside of that, I don't have a whole lot to add. I'm here to answer any questions about the development. I think Dean's captured the intent of the application and has summarized the arguments pretty well. So I don't have anything additional to add at this time, but if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer anything about the development.
Any questions for the applicant?
So in terms of the authority of this board, the authority of this board lies in its ability to approve plans and direct the issuance of building permits that staff can't approve administratively. And actually, this board is unique from the standpoint that its decisions are, one, final, and two, only appealable to district court. So the action today would authorize staff to issue a building permit that involved 135 housing units.
Okay.
I'm assuming you have structures in other areas that are similar in nature to this.
Yes, not exactly similar. We do have other historic rehabilitation projects in our portfolio. I'd have to go back and look at our portfolio in the state of Kansas. I know we have a few in Texas and one in Colorado as well.
Similar density?
Yeah, I would say pretty similar in density to these as well.
Would that density then provide adequate and comfortable living spaces for the occupants?
Yeah, so I think a good frame of reference is this is phase 2 in comparison to phase 1 of the Lee buildings. They both fall under the same housing program administered by the state of Kansas. And so there are a bunch of requirements that the state has in terms of the livability of the space. And so all of the units in building 2 will match those requirements. And so, the success of the initial phase and the lease up structure that we have there, I think informs our design on phase 2. And so kind of taking that as a holistic argument, I think, from our perspective, we feel like there's ample space for each resident and that they're designed to a standard that, people can be proud of.
So we didn't want to get bog you down with too many drawings and plans, but you do have in your packet the floor plans for building 2 and 3. And so there's predominantly 1-bedroom apartments, but there's also some 2 and 3-bedroom apartments. But just there are some 2-bedrooms that are 932 square feet, and there's 1-bedrooms that are between 600 and 700 square feet. So from that standpoint, they're not, while you have the higher density in terms of total number of units, that is not being achieved by having squeezed down small units. A 932 square foot apartment is a pretty generously sized apartment. So.
Very good. Any other questions for the applicant? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Are there any questions from citizens?
We do not have anyone on Zoom right now from the public.
Very good, thank you. With that, we'll bring this item back to the board for possible action.
I move we approve application V22-12 with the residential density variance.
We have a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
We have a second. All in favor? Any other discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion carries. Thank you.
That motion carries 4-0 with Mr. Owens recusing himself.
Correct.
So a related companion application was another item we identified in our review of the preliminary plans, and this particular variance application goes to the question of off-street parking. And so one of the things we indicated in our report, and one of the unique aspects of residential housing downtown, is that as a general rule, a business locating or an office building locating in downtown area or a restaurant is not required to provide its own off-street parking. The reliance is on on-street and public parking to meet the parking needs. There are 2 exceptions to that. One is developments where residential apartments are the principal use, and hotels. And so in those 2 uses, there's a requirement that those uses provide their own off-street parking. But in the case of apartments, that off-street parking only has to be at 1/2 the rate of what is required for outside the downtown area. And so we talked about the density being over 43 units an acre. When this was initially reviewed in 2018, staff also identified that a parking variance might also be required to allow phases 2 and 3 to proceed. So we have phase 1. It's renovated and occupied, and as part of phase 1, there was a parking lot containing 50 spaces along North 5th Street that was built. And then through a license agreement, the City Commission approved 8 spaces in the south side of Elm Street along the north side of the building. So that provides 58 spaces that are dedicated to this development. And so staff determined that's adequate for phase 1, but not for proposed phases 2 and 3. And so on page 5, we just showed you our math or our handiwork. And so in the downtown area, apartments only have to provide parking at 1/2 the ratio for apartments outside the downtown. And so we showed how we determined that there were 45 spaces required for phase 1, and then we showed how we've determined that there's 106 total required off-street spaces to serve phases 1, 2, and 3 combined. And so in addition to the 50 spaces and the 8 spaces north of the building along Elm, there was a plan presented to provide 12 additional spaces across the street south of the Voot. And there's a typo in the report. I think the number says 700. That actually is 70. So that makes a big difference. So what we've determined is that there's 106 total spaces that would required by strict application of the code, and they are in a position to provide 70 off-street spaces. And so we have provided you with some information about the uniqueness, again, dealing with a multi-story vertical related development. These are multi-story loft-style apartments. In the downtown area, we have a number of loft apartments, but it's usually a 2-story building with a business below and 1 apartment above. This is 5 stories, so we're talking about lots of lofts. And so what we pointed out is that the density here is about 4 times denser than any other apartment development in Salina that's not for elderly housing. And so it's the very limited land area that creates the need for a parking variance. And of course, this is also different from some other greenfield apartment projects because of the shared parking and public parking that's available in the downtown area that's not available other places. 2 things the applicant points out in terms of impact on neighbors is that in the case of residential, the peak parking loads are generally when nearby businesses are closed. So you have apartment residences or residents that are at work. Their vehicles are not parking in the vicinity while other businesses are operating. And then when the residents return to the housing campus, that's when the needs of adjoining businesses tend to drop off. The other thing that the applicants have pointed out is that they have a number of residents that don't own vehicles, and that their monitoring of the existing parking lot shows that it's about half full, even with the occupancy of the north tower. And so it's their belief that a parking variance would not adversely affect neighboring properties through spillover effects because the existing parking area is underutilized. And so we do agree that they would have different peak hours. The exception to that would be the VU, which has a lot of nighttime and weekend activity and parking. But again, in the downtown area, we have surrounding on-street parking, and this helps mitigate the impact on neighbors. As far as the hardship, the applicants have pointed out for any parking to be a benefit to the residents of Lee Lofts, it would need to be very close to the campus. And if you look at the aerial photos and the surrounding areas with the post office and other things, there's very little opportunity for expansion of the campus. And so as we looked at this, the only downtown project of recent times that's even comparable to this would be the Homewood Hotel at Mulberry and Santa Fe. And as I noted, we also require parking for hotels, and those hotel developers had to acquire and clear a substantial number of properties to create surface parking for hotel patrons. But in this case, because of surrounding ownership and surrounding uses, this site is more landlocked than the Homewood Suites, and it's not as feasible to acquire and clear additional property to create additional parking as it was in that case. So as we point out, why do the cities require off-street parking? And the primary reasons are to avoid on-street congestion, the obstruction of driveways, and having vehicles trespassing on private parking lots owned by a different landowner. And those types of concerns are of lesser importance in the downtown area, where we have designed on-street parking, we have mass transit as well. And so we feel like if there is overflow parking that can be accommodated in on-street stalls on North Santa Fe and North Fifth Street, because those stalls are part of the street design, and overflow parking from loft residents should not cause street congestion on adjacent public streets. So we had a case that was partially about off-street and on-street parking. It wasn't the sole reason, but the Planning Commission had a public hearing about a drinking establishment known as the Library on South Santa Fe, and it was adjacent to a fairly narrow side street of Kerwin, and they didn't have enough off-street parking, which resulted in congestion on Kerwin. It resulted in blocked driveways. It involved patrons parking in parking lots that didn't belong to the establishment. And so those are the types of negative impacts that can occur if you don't have enough off-street parking. But we don't see any of those coming into play, because the difference between South Santa Fe and Kerwin and this situation is North Santa Fe and North Fifth Street were designed and built to accommodate on-street parking, even to encourage it. And so, of course, the purpose of having off-street parking is to have businesses or apartment projects that take care of their own employees, take care of their own customers, take care of their own residents, so that things don't spill over. But we have parking requirements for apartments that are based on a more suburban or greenfield standard. And so the applicants again point out that their existing parking lots are underutilized, and so they don't think building phases 2 and 3 is going to oversaturate the existing parking facilities. And so we would agree that the existing parking lot, from our observations, appear to be underutilized and has excess capacity. It would be helpful if the applicants could provide a little bit more additional data about vehicle ownership percentages among the residents of Phase 1 and what they anticipate for Phase 2. But again, we're talking about a calculated requirement of 106 spaces, a plan to provide 70 spaces, and that creates a gap of 36 spaces. And so the applicants have been conducting a bi-daily census on the number of parking spaces available, and so they have determined that only 54% of the respondents reported to owning a vehicle that routinely parked in any of the parking lots. They also found a recurring pattern of roughly 50% use of the existing parking lot. The applicants point out the general public parking in the surrounding area, the fact that this is on a city-go bus route. And so we want to encourage a dense development pattern that has walkability and pedestrian activities, but we do need to have sufficient spaces so we're not creating negative spillover effects on neighboring properties. So if you look at a 600-foot radius, which is what our requirement is for off-street parking. So in other words, if we look at facilities like the Salina YMCA or some healthcare facilities, there's a requirement that the parking that serves that use has to be located within 600 feet of the use itself. And so if you look at 600 feet of the Lee Lofts, then you can see that there's a number of on-street spaces and other publicly owned parking lots. And so we don't see congestion happening because the parking lot that's there seems to have additional capacity. And if we look at how the streets are designed on the surrounding area, Elm Street, Santa Fe, North Fifth Street are all designed to accommodate on-street parking, which is not the case everywhere in the community. And so as we look at this application, your alternatives this afternoon would be to approve the requested off-street parking variance. If you find that 70 off-street parking spaces are adequate to support the project, you could approve a lesser parking variance, less than 106 parking spaces required, but more than the 70 parking spaces proposed. This would require the applicant to look at other options for providing additional off-street spaces. You could postpone consideration of this request to a future meeting date if you feel like additional information needs to be provided by staff or the applicant, or you could deny the request if you don't think findings can be made to support an off-street parking variance. We have recommended 2 conditions if you were to approve this request, and one of those is our recommendation is based on the premise that this parking lot across the street will in fact get built. So that would be a condition of approval. And then having a sign posted on the lot across the street indicating that it's restricted to Lee Loft residents, so that would ensure that those spaces are in fact available for Lee Loft residents and wouldn't be for general use because it is across the street. So we have provided some findings on page 12 of your report, pointing out that off-street parking is not required for majority of the uses downtown. This is actually an exception. There is long-term public parking in the vicinity. If we look at Santa Fe and North Fifth, those are designed to accommodate and encourage on-street parking, so we're not going to create on-street congestion. The existing parking lot appears to be underutilized, and documentation is provided to that effect. And vehicle ownership rates at Lee Lofts are lower than other apartment projects. And we do have city-go bus service available for residents, which is not the case with all apartment projects. So with that, we would like the applicant to provide some additional information about projected car or vehicle ownership for the phases 2 and 3 or buildings 2 and 3, whether they anticipate that staying the same, and any information they can provide about what they're finding about percentage of residents who own and use their own personal vehicle. So with that, we'd be open to any questions that board members may have.
Are there any questions for staff? Hearing none, applicant, please approach the podium again. And you can go ahead and fill us in with other information that might be useful.
Yeah, so I guess I'm going to ask the same question before, just to make sure that we're clear on the approval process. I'm assuming this is the same sort of situation in terms of...
All variances are within the purview of this board to approve a permit with a lesser standard than what staff can do administratively. And so they're only subject to judicial review by the district court.
Okay. I guess the only other context that I would like to add to the arguments being made is, you know, we would really appreciate looking at the arguments in totality. I think it's easy to kind of take each individual piece of the argument and take a look at it and, you know, take a look at it and understand that, like, maybe that doesn't meet the full intent of requesting a variance, but we think that the totality of the argument is really what makes the compelling case to grant a request for a variance in this instance. A couple of clarifying points. We are a bit limited in the data that we have for the existing development. We don't require any sort of like permitting or registration of vehicles with the development. So the data that we have is based on surveys that we can send out to our residents and basically ask them, you know, how many of you use a car, or how many of you own a car, and how many of you park in the parking lot. So that's kind of a limitation of the data that we have. And then speaking to the utilization of the parking lots, our approach there was basically to go out and sample the utilization of the parking lots at different, you know, time periods during the day. And so usually once in the morning, once in the evening, to really get an understanding of kind of what the parking loads look like. And so that's kind of where we're putting together the argument that, you know, the space is currently underutilized, and the addition of the parking across the street with the new parking lot, we believe, is substantial enough to really, you know, meet the intent for providing all of parking for the residents. That coupled with, you know, the satellite lots, the public satellite lots in the local area, kind of add to capacity in that regard. And then we think, again, the City Go bus stops being so close also, you know, add to the case that, you know, parking is not going to be an issue for this development. I think from a design and like planning perspective too, one of the compelling arguments that we have for this development is, you know, we are limited in the fact that this is an adaptive reuse of a historic building. And so there are really only so many things we can do in terms of, you know, the space that's handed to us. We've tried to make as much use of the space as possible and provide a benefit to the community in that regard. And so being able to kind of, you know, piece off things where we can and really kind of meld an entire argument together is really what we're trying to do here. So I guess all of that being said, you know, really the intent that we would appreciate is, you know, looking at the argument in totality, and if there are any specific questions on that front, I'm more than happy to answer those as well.
Are there questions for the applicant?
I guess I got one question. The parking stall width, what was? 9. I think 8'6" is city minimum. And then question on that south parking lot, that property. Yeah, 8'6" is getting too tight. But on this property right here, did you guys purchase that piece, or was that with? On the existing lot?
You're talking about the southeast lot on Fifth Street?
Yep. That lower piece, was that a part of this property, or did you try to purchase more of that towards the south there?
Well, the problem with this aerial photo is it's out of date, so Dustin's going to need to show you the site plan. So that parking lot is built and complete, and that
Okay.
that comprises their campus. So sadly, our aerial photos are becoming out of date, but that is existing and functioning, and the supplemental material that with the photographs from the lot and stuff were taken of that lot. So that has been built and inspected and is in use, and the lot on the west side of Santa Fe has not been built yet. It's proposed.
But I guess on that existing lot that's done, did you purchase any additional property there, or was that little south portion, was that just a part of the original property?
Part of the whole complex, and then I believe it was lot split off and deeded to the Phase 1 development. So the ownership structure for that lot originally has been in Phase 1, and then there'll be a cross-use agreement with Phase 2 and Phase 3 to utilize that lot.
So you purchased a little bit more land for that parking lot, I guess is my question.
I would have to go back. Candidly, I was not a part of the development when the land was purchased, but it's my understanding that that was
The
purchased.
only part that wasn't original is right here.
Yep, yep.
And so the original, what considered a Lee complex, did not include this piece here. It's under the same ownership, but it was just purchased at a different time.
Oh,
But it was all done in 2018, and so it was part and parcel of that, but it wasn't part of the original, what would be considered the campus for Phase 1. And then one of the reasons when there was a conditional use permit for this project done by the Planning Commission, where we said that we thought that a parking variance could be needed, there was some discussion and contemplation at the time of going farther south on Fifth Street and purchasing like the plumbing property to the south and having it available for additional parking, but that did not occur. So what we have outlined in blue on the maps that we have in the staff report is the extent of what the Overland Property Group owns and controls in that area. So it was open-ended at the time that there was a possibility for additional property to the south on Fifth Street to be acquired, but it was not. So there was some, at the time, even what was happening, what the alley was purchasing and what they were going to own and end up with was uncertain at the time. But this got a different ownership, and it's not and never was part of the Lee building campus. But initially this line was straight across here, and this is a separate lot, and it was acquired at a separate point in time with a separate deed, but it was all incorporated together in 2018.
So you'll probably still try to outsource extra parking in the future, depending on your needs. Try to keep that open.
Yeah, I think, our approach is, again, we're going to do what's best for the residents at the end of the day. And so to answer a question that was raised earlier, our projections for the next phase would be that, Phase 2 is administered through the same program with Kansas Housing. And so from a projection, we expect the tenant mix to be very similar. So I think in terms of like a car ownership percentage structure, I think it's going to be very similar. And again, we're open to, we're going to provide what we need to the residents. So if in the future a parking need does arise, we would absolutely address that if that's the case. And so I think right now the request would be, again, the totality of the argument with the information that we have now is that we don't believe that we're going to exceed, or we don't believe that, granting a variance is gonna cause issues for us. But if it becomes the case down the line and there's a need to include more parking, we will absolutely do that for the residents.
And it's not specifically your purview, but just for the benefit of board members to understand when we talk about financial feasibility, is that on a adaptive reuse like this, the developers are utilizing low and moderate income tax credits that limits the incomes of the residents who can rent in those tax credit units. They're utilizing historic tax credits because these buildings are on the National Register of Historic Places, and then they're utilizing the city's neighborhood revitalization property tax rebate program. And so to make the rehabilitation of a complex of building like this feasible, you kind of have to stack those various credits and incentives on top of each other to make it work. So it's a pretty, financially, it's a pretty complex, not only for the owners, but also for the city government and other government entities, because there's tax credits and other financing tools at work here.
So if you take your formula that you were thinking in the process and apply it to phases 2 and 3, what percentage of utilization would you come up with at that point? Would it be 100% then?
So I think at that point, we would be right up at that 100% utilization. The supporting material that was provided kind of walks through the math, and it basically, we arrive at that, the 70 unit or the 70 parking lot amount by kind of projecting off of what we have today. So that would be a full utilization.
Mm-hmm. And I would assume too that the parking becomes a benefit of residing at that location. And so if it becomes difficult to guarantee parking, then that tends to hurt business.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I believe one of the recommendations from staff was to put a sign up on the lot across the street saying, reserved for parking at the Lee Lofts residence. I think to clarify a little bit more about the sort of the unit structure between the two buildings, Phase 2, the larger building will have 50 affordable units in it, and then Phase 3, the satellite building attached to it, will have 32 market rate units. So there are different, I don't want to say strings because I don't know if that's the right terminology, but for lack of a better term, there are different strings attached to each of those developments. One, having state funding and sort of the strings that will associate with those, and then one not having those. I think absolutely it becomes a business, a business case issue if at some point we run out of parking and then, a new tenant wants to come and they have a car and they don't have a parking lot, then that becomes an issue for us as well. So it's a balance of an economic and just a resident amenity issue. And again, I think the totality of our argument, we're confident that we have the parking required by the background of the development. But again, if it becomes an issue down the line, we can absolutely address that.
Mm-hmm. What is the planned completion date for 3?
Yeah, so both of the buildings are going to follow. Right now, they're both going to follow the same timeline. We're working through details on that, but the projected timeline right now is a construction start date, in the March-April timeframe, and then we're anticipating anywhere from 12 to 15 months for completion. So you'd be looking at anywhere from like March to June of 2024 for the buildings to be operational at that point.
Other questions? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Are there any comments from the public?
We do not have anyone on Zoom from the public at the moment.
Thank you. We will bring this item back to the board for possible action and discussion.
I move we approve the off-street parking variance with the staff's recommendations on page 12 of the staff report.
Okay, we have a motion to approve application V22-13 with the recommendations by the staff in the packet. Is there a second?
Second.
Any further discussion? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. All right, any unfinished thank you for coming today. Any unfinished or other business that we need to discuss?
We don't have any unfinished business. We reported earlier that this board had denied a sign variance request by Subway, and they did find a way to replace and rebrand their store without needing a variance, and so that has moved forward just with smaller signs, and we don't have any other business for you this evening. We will meet in January 2023 to review your annual report and any cases that we might have at that time, but we don't have anything else other than say we'll see this board next year.
Very good. And I'm assuming there's no public forum?
We do not have anyone from the public on Zoom or in the room currently.
Okay, very good. Thank you. And if there's no other business then, we are adjourned.